A liberal professor mocks Clint Eastwood, dismissing him as outdated and irrelevant. But when Clint calmly responds, his words leave the entire audience speechless. What starts as ridicule turns into a powerful lesson no one expects. The university auditorium buzzed with anticipation as students and faculty filled the rows, eager to hear Dr. Alan Grayson's lecture on modern cinema and societal progress. The professor, known for his sharp wit and unfiltered critiques, thrived in these settings where his words could challenge, provoke, and reshape perspectives. Today, his subject centered on the evolution of masculinity in film, a topic he had spoken about often. But this time, he had a particular target in mind. As he paced the stage, gesturing with the ease of a seasoned orator, he launched into a critique of classic Hollywood archetypes, particularly the lone, rugged hero. His tone turned pointed as he singled out one man in particular, Clint Eastwood. With a chuckle, he described Eastwood's roles as relics of a bygone era, portraying masculinity as stoic, aggressive, and emotionally stunted. He dismissed the cowboy gunslingers and no-nonsense detectives as simplistic, outdated fantasies of strength. These films, he declared, glorify violence and an individualism that has no place in an evolved society. His words drew scattered applause and laughter from the audience, emboldening him to continue. "Take Dirty Harry, for instance," he said, shaking his head. "A vigilante cop who takes justice into his own hands? That's not heroism, it's recklessness." Or the outlaw Josie Wales, a man whose response to tragedy is simply more violence, coated in a thin veneer of righteousness. His voice dripped with sarcasm as he leaned on the podium. "Tell me, is that really the kind of role model we need today?" The crowd responded with murmurs of agreement, some nodding along, others chuckling at his pointed criticism. A few students exchanged glances, some appearing uncertain. One, sitting near the middle, hesitated before raising a hand. "Professor," he began, his voice tinged with curiosity, "what would you say to Clint Eastwood himself if he were here?" Dr. Grayson smirked, relishing the opportunity to drive his point home. "Well," he said, spreading his arms, "I'd tell him that his brand of masculinity and heroism is a thing of the past. Society has moved on." A voice, deep and unmistakably calm, rose from the back of the room. "Well, Professor, I'd love to hear more about that." The room froze. Heads turned, murmurs swept through the audience, and even Dr. Grayson's confident stance wavered for a brief moment. Sitting near the back, clad in his usual understated manner, was Clint Eastwood himself. His weathered face was unreadable, his posture relaxed but steady. Despite his presence commanding the room, there was no hostility in his expression, only curiosity. A charged silence filled the space before Dr. Grayson forced a chuckle, though it lacked its earlier confidence. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "Mr. Eastwood, this is certainly unexpected." Clint offered a small nod. "Didn't mean to interrupt, just thought it might be worth talking about, seeing as I'm part of the conversation." The audience sat in rapt attention, watching the unexpected exchange unfold. Dr. Grayson squared his shoulders, determined to maintain control of the discussion. "All right then," he said, "let's talk. Do you think the kind of masculinity your films portray is still relevant today?" Clint took a moment before answering, his voice steady and deliberate. "Depends on what you mean by masculinity, Professor." He leaned forward slightly. "If you're saying we don't need men who act tough just for the sake of it, I'd agree. But if you're saying there's no place for men who stand by their principles, who don't back down from doing what's right, then I'd have to disagree." Dr. Grayson crossed his arms. "But isn't that the problem? Your films often show heroes who solve their problems with force. That's not exactly a nuanced message." Clint let out a quiet chuckle. "You ever actually watch those films, Professor? or just the parts people like to criticize? He shook his head slightly. It was never about glorifying violence. It was about consequences, about choices. Dirty Harry wasn't just about a man with a gun. It was about a man struggling with a system that let innocent people suffer. Josie Wales wasn't just about revenge. It was about a man learning to build something after losing everything. A few students leaned forward, their expressions shifting. The certainty with which they had laughed at the professor's earlier remarks was now tinged with contemplation. Dr. Grayson, sensing the shift, pushed on. But wouldn't you agree that the world needs less of that kind of rugged individualism? That we should be focusing on cooperation and emotional intelligence, rather than this man-against-the-world ideal? Clint nodded. Nothing wrong with cooperation. But tell me, Professor, when times get hard, when things fall apart, do you think people follow the loudest voice or the strongest one? The one who knows what they stand for? He let the question hang for a moment. The world's always going to need people who have the backbone to do what's right, even when it's not easy. That's not outdated. That's necessary. A murmur ran through the crowd, quieter this time. Some students exchanged looks considering his words. Others, who had laughed before, now seemed less sure. Dr. Grayson exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the podium. So you believe that kind of strength is missing today? Clint didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave a small shrug. I think we got a lot of folks afraid to stand for anything at all. The silence stretched. Dr. Grayson looked down for a moment, his confident posture softening. He had walked into this discussion certain of his stance, certain that the past was something to be critiqued and discarded. Yet as he looked out at his students, many of whom seemed genuinely engaged, perhaps even inspired, he felt a rare moment of self-reflection. For the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning whether he had been too quick to dismiss the past in his eagerness to embrace the future. Dr. Grayson hesitated for only a moment before regaining his composure. He was an academic, after all, trained in debate and rhetoric, and if anything, he saw this as an opportunity to prove his point in real time. He straightened his posture and met Clint's gaze, his voice measured but firm. Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, your films glorify violence and outdated ideals. Do you think we should still live in a world where men solve problems with guns and brute force? Clint didn't flinch. If anything, there was the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, not out of amusement, but as if he had heard this argument before and was in no hurry to rush his response. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, and said, Professor, my films tell stories about people making choices, about standing for something. It's never been about violence for the sake of violence. Dr. Grayson exhaled through his nose, as though already expecting such an answer. That's a convenient way of framing it, he said, tilting his head. But take Dirty Harry, for instance, a police officer who disregards the law and enforces justice as he sees fit. Or the outlaw Josie Wales, a man who solves his problems with a gun. Isn't that just promoting vigilantism? A black and white view of justice? Clint gave a slow nod, his expression remaining unreadable. What those films show, he said, is that sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, that standing up for what's right can make you an outcast. But we all have to ask ourselves, do we live by principles, or do we just follow the crowd? A murmur spread through the room. A few students who had initially laughed at the professor's critiques now shifted in their seats, considering Clint's words. Some leaned forward, more engaged than before. The weight of the question hung in the air, pressing into the space between them. Dr. Grayson, sensing the shift, pushed forward, unwilling to let the conversation slip from his control. But don't you think that kind of thinking is outdated? He countered. Today's world is more complex than the one in your films. Modern cinema reflects that. It embraces moral ambiguity, inclusivity, intellectualism. We've moved beyond the simplistic hero who solves everything with a clenched jaw and a revolver. Clint took his time before responding, his eyes steady on the professor. "Nothing wrong with complexity, Professor," he said evenly. "But tell me, do young people today have more clarity about right and wrong? Do they have the strength to stand up for something even when it's hard?" The professor opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. A few students exchanged glances, and some even nodded in quiet agreement. Clint continued, his voice quiet but firm. "The world will always need people who have the courage to do what's right, no matter the cost. That's not outdated. That's timeless." The air in the auditorium had changed. What had started as an amusing critique of old-school masculinity had turned into something else entirely. The students, who had initially laughed at Dr. Grayson's remarks about Clint Eastwood's films, were now silent, listening with rapt attention. Some leaned forward, elbows on their knees, absorbing every word. Even those who had been skeptically entertained now seemed contemplative. Dr. Grayson, sensing the shift, adjusted his stance. He was an experienced speaker, accustomed to commanding the room, but for the first time in a long while, he felt himself losing ground. Clint Eastwood, with his steady demeanor and deliberate words, had turned the conversation into something deeper than he had expected. But the professor wasn't ready to back down completely. He cleared his throat and tried to pivot the discussion. "But Mr. Eastwood, in your films, problems are often solved through force. Isn't that a dangerous message to send? That brute strength, not reason, is the answer?" Clint chuckled softly, the sound low and knowing, as if he had heard this argument many times before. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "You know, Professor, I grew up during the Great Depression. My parents didn't have, much, but they taught me something that stuck. Hard work, responsibility, and standing by your word matter more than anything. In my films, it's not about force, it's about resolve." A hush settled over the room as Clint continued. "See, people like to look at my movies and focus on the action, the guns, the tough guys, but they miss the real point. It's not about who can throw the hardest punch or shoot the fastest. It's about standing for something, about having a backbone when the world tries to knock you down, about doing what's right, even when it's not easy." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I never needed anyone to tell me what a man should be," Clint continued. "I learned by watching my father, by working hard, by making mistakes, by seeing what happens when you don't take responsibility for your own life. The trouble today isn't that we've moved past masculinity, it's that we've forgotten what true strength is. Strength isn't about violence, it's about character." A few students nodded in agreement. Then, unexpectedly, a small ripple of applause started from the back. It wasn't loud or forced, just a few students clapping as if they couldn't help themselves. It grew slowly, spreading through the crowd, until nearly half the room was clapping. Dr. Grayson glanced at the students, clearly aware that he had lost their full support. He sighed, rubbing his chin, his expression shifting from debate to reflection. "So, you're saying we've lost something in trying to redefine masculinity?" he asked, his tone quieter now. Clint nodded. "Progress is good, Professor. Change is necessary. But in moving forward, we should be careful not to throw away the things that make us strong. Honor, responsibility, courage. Those things aren't toxic. They're necessary." A deep silence followed. For the first time, Dr. Grayson wasn't thinking about his next argument, his next rebuttal. He was thinking, and the students, watching this moment unfold, knew they had witnessed something rare, a true exchange of ideas, one that went beyond the usual debates they had grown accustomed to. Dr. Grayson exhaled deeply, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment. The weight of the discussion sat heavily on him, not in defeat but in realization. He had entered the lecture hall confident, certain of his perspective, sure that his intellectual approach to cinema and culture was the most enlightened. Yet here he was, faced with a man whose wisdom wasn't wrapped in academic theory, but in a lifetime of experience. And somehow, against all expectations, Clint Eastwood had not only stood his ground, but had done so with dignity, humility, and unshakable principles. For the first time in a long while, Dr. Grayson found himself at a loss for words. Then slowly, he looked up and did something unexpected. He nodded. "You know, Clint," he said, his voice quieter now, no longer carrying the performative confidence of a lecturer, but the sincerity of a man deep in thought. "I came in today, thinking I had all the answers, but you've given me something to think about." Clint smiled, a small, knowing expression that carried no gloating, no arrogance, just understanding. "That's all any of us can do. Keep thinking, keep learning," he said. Dr. Grayson let out a short laugh, almost at himself, and ran a hand through his hair. "I guess I've been so focused on looking forward that I never stopped to consider what we might have left behind." Clint nodded. "Nothing wrong with moving forward, Professor. The trick is knowing what to take with you." The auditorium was silent for a moment, as if everyone was absorbing the gravity of the exchange. Then, almost without cue, the students began to clap. It started small, a few hesitant hands coming together, then grew into something greater. A standing ovation erupted, not just for Clint Eastwood, but for the discussion itself, for the rare and genuine exchange of ideas that had unfolded before them. Dr. Grayson turned slightly, taking in the scene. The students who had once laughed at Clint's name were now standing, applauding, some even cheering. It was clear that whether they agreed with everything Clint had said or not, they respected him. They had seen something in him that they couldn't ignore. Conviction, integrity, and a perspective that had been forged, not in theory, but in reality. As the applause finally settled, students began gathering their things, buzzing with quiet conversation about what they had just witnessed. A few of them, rather than heading straight for the exits, made their way toward Clint. A young woman approached. Him first, hesitant at first, but determined. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, "I just wanted to say, I never really thought much about your movies before. I guess I bought into the idea that they were just about action. But after hearing you talk, I think I understand them differently now. There's more to them than I realized." Clint shook her hand and gave a small nod. "Glad to hear that," he said. "Stories mean different things to people at different times in their lives. What matters is that you're willing to look and closer." A young man followed, his expression more serious. "I appreciate what you said about standing up for something," he admitted. "I don't know if I always do that. It's easy to go along with what everyone else thinks." Clint studied him for a moment before replying, "It takes practice. Strength isn't something you wake up with one day. It's something you build, choice by choice." The young man nodded thoughtfully before shaking Clint's hand and stepping back. More students approached, each wanting a moment, a word, a handshake. Dr. Grayson stood watching from a distance, his arms crossed as he observed the effect Clint had on his students. He hadn't expected this. In fact, he had expected the opposite. He had thought the conversation would reinforce his own views, cementing his belief that Clint Eastwood represented an era that no longer had relevance in modern times. But what he had seen was different. The students weren't clinging to outdated ideals. They were responding to something deeper, something that transcended generational divides. After a while, Clint turned back toward Dr. Grayson, nodding in quiet acknowledgement. The professor returned the gesture, then extended a hand. "Thank you, Clint," he said, his voice filled with more humility than before. "I may not agree with everything, but I respect what you stand for." Clint took his hand in a firm shake. "That's all any of us can ask for, Professor." With that, Clint gave one last look at the crowd before making his way toward the exit. The auditorium emptied slowly, students still caught up in quiet discussions, dissecting what they had just witnessed. Dr. Grayson remained behind. He walked slowly to the podium, running a hand over the wood, staring out at the now empty seats. He had lectured in this room for years, filling it with his thoughts, his theories, his critiques. And yet today, he had learned something himself. Still, deep in thought, he made his way back to his office. The space was dimly lit, the glow of his desk lamp casting shadows along the walls. He lowered himself into his chair, rubbing his chin as his eyes wandered around the room. Then, his gaze landed on something he had never paid much attention to before. A framed quote on the wall. It had been there for years. A decoration more than anything, something he had placed absent-mindedly and never given much thought. A man's got to have a code, a creed to live by. He had always seen it as just another platitude, a relic of old-fashioned thinking. But tonight, it meant something. Tonight, for the first time, he truly understood it.